Welcome to the Mongabay Newscast. I am your host, Mike DiGirolamo, bringing you the news and inspiration from nature's front line. This week on the newscast, we present to you Episode 2 in our Congo Basin season of our long-form podcast series from Mongabay Explores. If you aren't already subscribed to Mongabay Explores, you can find it on the podcast provider of your choice. Make sure to check out our first episode in the season, which was also published here on the newscast. With that said, enjoy the second episode of Mongabay Explores the Congo Basin. When you see or hear the word conservation, it is often popularly used to discuss ecosystems, landscapes, and species. Historically, however, very rarely is it used in reference to the people who inhabit those ecosystems. How land becomes protected, or how it doesn't, is a long and sometimes violent story, especially in the Congo Basin and Central Africa. It often involves the displacement and deaths of local and indigenous communities, the exploitation of natural resources for political or economic gain, and armed groups decimating wildlife. People who have inhabited these lands for centuries often are faced with aggressive measures by state and private entities to heavily regulate their use of that land on behalf of conservation. This contentious model is often referred to as fortress conservation, and it is at the heart of a debate on how to best preserve the natural ecosystems of the Congo Basin. A debate that has historically left locals out of the conversation. But that is beginning to change. I'm Mike DiGirolamo. This is Mongabay Explores, a podcast series about our world's unique places, species, and the people working to save them. You're listening to Episode 2 of our 4th season, Mongabay Explores the Congo Basin. In this episode, we dive into the complex topic of fortress conservation and the militarization of rangers tasked with patrolling protected areas, a trend which sees paramilitary groups becoming more and more involved in the conservation arena, exacerbating already existing tension of local and indigenous communities with protected areas and the people who manage them. I speak with Goldman Prize winner Samuel Nguiffo, a Cameroonian lawyer with decades of experience working in Central Africa on forest protection. Mongabay features writer Ashoka Mukpo, who has covered conservation issues in Central and West Africa, and Vedaste Cituli, a PhD student in political science at the Catholic University of Louvain in Belgium, with experience working in indigenous and conservation relations in Kahuzi-Biega National Park. It should be noted that fortress conservation and the militarization of conservation are two different but very closely related issues. To better explain this, I asked both Ashoka and Samuel to define fortress conservation in their own words and its history in Central Africa.
My name is Ashoka Mukpo. I am a features writer on staff here at Mongabay, and I've been here since April 2020. What we call fortress conservation in terms of that phrase goes back to the 70s and the 80s. But actually, you can bring it much, much earlier than that and look at the very beginning of protected areas in general, many of which were in the United States and were established by the American government very soon after its westward expansion into lands that used to kind of, and still sort of were occupied by indigenous peoples. So it was this idea really that to protect landscapes, you had to kind of cordon them off, not just from industrial interests like loggers or miners, but also people themselves who might have traditionally used those areas for either hunting or fishing or, other activities that have been a part of their culture and their way of life, for hundreds and hundreds of years. So this model of protected areas that was really sort of developed inside the United States was then subsequently exported to places like Africa, Central America, South America, and Asia, where habitats where wildlife, such as elephants and other big game, lived, were considered to be or presented to be under threat from hunting and poaching. And so the idea of a protected area was that you would create a landscape that was managed somehow that would keep hunters or other threats to the wildlife out. But really, if you sort of look at the history of a lot of these areas, The reason actually that many of them were created was really to protect hunting rights for either colonial officials or other European interests that had kind of dispossessed and displaced many of the indigenous people who actually lived there.
Perhaps the most prominent example of this model was the Congo's first preserve, Kahuzi-Biega National Park. While this park was originally established in 1937 by Belgian colonialists, it was later expanded by Mobutu Sese Seko, the DRC's former president, and Belgium in the 1970s. 6,000 people of the Batwa indigenous community were forced off their land. Vedaste Cituli, who works in the park, paints a picture where locals today consider the park a geographic fear.
Vedaste Cituli. I'm a PhD student in political and social science at Université Catholique de Louvain in Belgium. And teacher in Angaza Institute in Institut Supérieur de Développement Rural, ISDR Bukavu, in eastern of DRC. Nowadays, we know that in Congo Basin, we make many parks, and in this park, local community and autochthonous people, we consider a park like a geographic fear.
And while the removal of the Batwa occurred many years ago, promises to compensate them for their losses have come and gone, with no action. In 2019, following the encouragement of national election candidates, the Autochthon, the local indigenous population, sometimes referred to as pygmies, tried to re-enter the park, leading to violence between park rangers and the Autochthon, one of whom was reportedly killed. A string of conflict leaving dozens of locals killed has persisted in the park ever since, according to reports released by the minority rights group and the Initiative for Equality.
Notamment parmi les injustices que je vous ai parlé, je vous ai montré qu'on se rend compte que même les populations qui ont été expulsées.
In particular, among the injustices that I have spoken to you about, I have shown you that we realize that even the populations that were expelled, that were chased from the forests when they were converted into protected areas, the states have not been able to compensate these populations. Here I am referring to the indigenous pygmy populations, the Batwa, in the Great Lakes region. They were chased out of the forest, and when they were converted into protected areas, conflicts were created. As for example, in the site where I work, the Kahuzi-Biega National Park, where there is a permanent state of conflict. It is a conflict that persists between these pygmy populations and the managers of the protected areas, and each time they say that they will compensate them, but there is no compensation ever made. Samuel Nguiffo has been working in the Congo Basin for over 20 years. He's a Goldman Prize winner who was recognized for his work in forest protection and indigenous rights in Cameroon during the proposal of the Chad-Cameroon pipeline back in 1999. I wanted to get his perspective on how fortress conservation has evolved and impacted the Congo Basin over the past 2 decades and where he's worked in Cameroon.
My name is Samuel Nguiffo. I work for the Center for Environment and Development. It's an NGO based in Yaoundé, Cameroon, and working in all the Congo Basin countries on forest and other natural resources issues, and focusing a lot on local and indigenous communities' rights. I was awarded the Goldman Prize in 1999 for Africa. And as stated by the Goldman Foundation, it was for the work on the protection of the forest in Cameroon and the protection of indigenous people's rights in Cameroon, with a special focus on the Chad-Cameroon pipeline project that was crossing the forest and indigenous communities' land. We were very active with my colleagues working on indigenous people's rights and working on the Chad-Cameroon pipeline project back then. Most often, the indigenous and local communities are those who are excluded. The purpose being to protect the area, to protect the nature, to protect the nature against the people, against those using the space, and those claiming rights on the space and working actively to keep their rights to use the space. To me, this is forest conservation. It started very long ago in the colonial days, and we can still see it up to now.
While protected areas had been around since the colonization of Central Africa, Samuel witnessed the creation of protected areas in Cameroon only decades ago. He described the before and after to me, which, as both Vedaste and Ashoka have described, often don't include the consultation of indigenous communities, and can lead to their expulsion, cutting them off from land they rely on. As Samuel describes, daily livelihood activities were suddenly made illegal, often without their knowledge, and in cases where homes were inside of a new protected area, they were destroyed.
When I started working on forest issues around 25 years ago, I started working in places where the level of biodiversity was very high. But those places were not technically, some of those places were not technically considered as protected areas. So despite the very high rate of biodiversity, communities were still able to use the space and also to use the resources. In fact, they were claiming customary property on the land and on the resources. And what I saw in some of these cases was the process for establishing protected areas in some of those places. And the process was, I will say, not very participatory. There was no consultation, no or very little consultation, and communities from one day to the other were out of the place. Sometimes technically out of the place, in the sense that some houses of indigenous communities were literally destroyed because they were inside of a protected area, of a newly established protected area. And sometimes the villages were outside of the protected area, but communities did not have the right to go inside. So from one day to the other, without changing anything to what you have been doing so far, part of your life, part of your activities suddenly became against the law. And sometimes you did not even know what was the process for getting there. So this is one case with the establishment of a network of protected areas.
Hunting grounds that locals previously relied on were no longer available to them, Samuel says, giving the perception that the government viewed the animals as more important than the locals themselves.
In other cases, what I knew when I started was to see how existing protected areas were managed. And talking to communities back then, I realized that they perceive it as being something unjust, because they did not have the right to go back to places where they used to go when they were younger. And the old generation used to tell the younger generations about sacred places in some of those protected areas. And of course, it was really difficult to access the places and to continue carrying out their activities, including hunting, including visiting the sacred sites. So in both cases, I think it was perceived by the communities as being something unjust, something that they did not understand. And very often, communities tend to say they have the feeling that in the eyes of those involved into conservation, animals were more important than local and indigenous communities. And I think this was the case back then.
Ashoka mentions one of the factors that led to the creation of many of the protected areas in East Africa, which was to protect hunting rights for European landowners. However, in the 1970s and 80s, there was a fortress conservation boom in response to the ivory poaching crisis, which saw the creation and expansion of this conservation model, along with more heavy-handed tactics meant to reduce poaching.
So today, when we talk about fortress conversation, it's sort of like you have to situate it within this much larger history of creating boundaries around landscapes and then presenting threats to wildlife, often as being primarily coming from people who live around the parks. And, this is sort of the resurgence of this model of conservation really sort of starts again in the 60s and 70s when you have a big poaching crisis, especially in Africa around elephant populations. And there was a real sense that this, danger to elephants required a very robust response of making sure that they were safe inside of their habitats and that they, weren't going to just be basically poached to extinction.
It's a model that's now the subject of a fierce debate, especially after a BuzzFeed News expose in 2018 that linked park rangers connected to the World Wildlife Fund, WWF, with serious human rights abuses, including torture, rape, and murder. The revelations led to some funding being withdrawn from WWF by the US Congress and stricter regulations on how American conservation grants are spent. With a declaration to protect 30% of the world's biodiversity by 2030, known as 30 by 30, which was agreed to at last year's Convention on Biological Diversity, the debate has taken center stage in the conservation world. Many indigenous leaders and experts say that drawing sharp lines between people and nature is harmful and outdated. Nearly 80% of the world's biodiversity is currently managed by indigenous populations. One of the main criticisms of protected areas is the underlying idea of a pristine wilderness, untouched by human influence. Some experts have argued that image is flawed and a Eurocentric construct, pointing to the way people have helped manage and shape these ecosystems over generations. Removing them from the picture, the argument goes, is not just a human rights abuse, it's also just a bad idea if conservation is your end goal. On the other hand, as Ashoka details here, organizations that manage protected areas can often point to data that shows rebounding biodiversity.
Organizations that adopt a forceful approach towards managing ecosystems often do have data to back up that approach works, whether it's a reduction in poaching of large animals or, recovery of populations. For example, in Salonga, there were studies that showed that bonobo populations were increasing, concurrent to WWF and the ICCN's tight management of that space. Akagera has shown, there's a boost in tourism revenues since African parks took it over. There are, biodiversity indicators that it's doing much better than it was 10, 15 years ago. So these organizations often can point to those successes as an argument in favor of their model. And I think that, the obvious sort of response to that, especially if you look at something like Salonga, which admittedly is an extreme case, is at what cost?
With all the attention and criticism, have things changed? A little, yes. Samuel details a case in Campoman National Park in Cameroon where he has worked on facilitating discussions between park officials and locals that included giving them back their right to hunt within park grounds by a distance of 2 kilometers, limiting it to small mammals. It's a model that Samuel says could be replicated elsewhere.
There have been a lot of discussions, lot of activities, lot of fights between local and indigenous communities on one hand, and conservation organizations on the other hand. The purpose was to say we can't live like that. We need to have access. And now I will say things are a little bit different. In the discourse, there is a lot of discussion about involving local and indigenous communities. In practice, it's a bit more difficult because there is no clear model of how local and indigenous communities can be involved into conservation. But we have been seeing here and there some activities going on, showing the possibility for local and indigenous communities to be involved. In some cases, for example, and we started that in Campo back, I will say 15 years, 20 years ago, in the Campoman National Park, we supported a discussion between indigenous communities and the park managers, resulting into the inclusion in the National Park Management Plan of the possibility for indigenous communities living in the area to continue carrying out their activities inside the park. So technically, this was against the law because the law says inside the national park, no human activity except for research and conservation. But in this case, we were able to manage in a discussion to have the national park, the management plan of the national park, recognizing the right for indigenous communities to hunt inside the park, 2 kilometers inside the park, and to focus on small animals, not on large mammals. This was against the law, but it was a compromise. And from there has been a lot of discussions about trying to do the same in the southeast of Cameroon. And I think it's a sign showing that things could be moving in the right direction, but we are not yet there. This is still an ongoing discussion, and there are still a lot of misunderstandings between local and indigenous communities on one hand, and the conservation activities, conservation managers on the other hand.
However, change, if it occurs at all, is slow, and life for locals inside many protected areas can be anything but safe. Altercations with rangers are frequent inside of some parks, often leading to resentment and conflict. One of the most notable examples is Salonga National Park in the Congo, which was the site of some of the worst ranger abuses. While the rangers themselves worked for the Congolese government, an independent review panel found that WWF had evidence of those abuses for years without acting on them.
So really, I think it's important to say that anywhere that you're creating a control regime, you're going to have some form of conflict. It's just all about how serious that conflict is, how it's mitigated, and what the source of that conflict is. So that can go anywhere from people being upset at not being able to fish in a stream or not being able to hunt in grounds that maybe they'd hunted in for hundreds and hundreds of years, all the way up to really serious instances of human rights abuses like what we saw not just in Salonga, but in other parks in Cameroon and Republic of Congo, where there were actual murders and rapes and instances of torture that were inflicted on indigenous people by park rangers whose mandate was to protect wildlife. So I think that the one that had the most attention paid to it in recent years was the case of WWF, the World Wildlife Fund, which was working with rangers in various countries to protect some of these areas through government partnerships that this organization had. And it turned out that those rangers actually were, in many cases, inflicting very, very serious and awful forms of violence on indigenous people. Now, I think maybe one good specific example would be Salonga National Park, which is a park in the Democratic Republic of Congo. This park is a beautiful, vast landscape that's home to bonobos and chimpanzees and various other important, often threatened wildlife. And so it's considered to be a priority by conservationists. But of course, this is also an area where there's a lot of human beings who live not just around the park, but at some point lived inside the park. So WWF has partnerships with the DRC's Conservation Management Agency, which is called the ICCN. And under these management agreements that they have with the ICCN, WWF sort of supervises the conservation activities of the park, but then the rangers and patrolling are nominally under control of the Congolese government. What happened is that these rangers, who were sort of acting as a kind of security force for the park, there's instances that they killed people. There's instances that they, in their sort of anti-poaching and spatial control operations, inflicted really serious violence on people. And this was brought to light originally by organizations like Survival International and the Rainforest Foundation in the UK. And then eventually there was a BuzzFeed report that generated a lot of attention that led to, a huge outcry, not just among conservation supporters or sort of average people, but actually lawmakers and some of the funders of WWF's activities as well. So, this is a very long story with a lot of sort of twists and turns, but WWF commissioned an independent panel of experts, so people who didn't work for WWF but had some understanding of its activities, to review what it had done in the Congo Basin and not done that could have allowed some of these abuses to happen, or what it could have done better. And what this panel found, and it's really interesting because there's a lot of misrepresentation of its findings, where the headlines was, the WWF staff didn't participate in any of these abuses, which is sort of technically true. But if you read that report carefully, what it said was that there were reports of these abuses that were shared with WWF staff going way back to 2008. So you're dealing with a decade plus of WWF staff having reports of human rights abuses, very severe human rights abuses against Indigenous people that were not really followed up on, or in some cases, when contractors were hired to do research and review the veracity of these allegations, and they came back with damning reports, those reports were either edited to be softer for management or simply buried. So really, I think WWF has sort of portrayed itself as having been exonerated by this panel's report, but I think the reality is that the report was quite critical of their lack of response to the allegations.
The International Ranger Federation has an International Ranger Code of Conduct, and the panel that investigated the incidents in Salonga urged WWF to create binding agreements for rangers, which they say they did. But could codes of conduct actually prevent violence? Not really, Ashoka argues, if there's no reliable way to police ranger behavior or a trustworthy way to report abuse. Furthermore, he says, it doesn't solve the wider range of cultural and social impacts that aren't necessarily considered a human rights abuse.
I mean, I think that's a tough question, right? Because on one hand, a code of conduct is very helpful in delineating, what the most serious forms of abuse would be and what a ranger should and shouldn't do in the course of his operations or her operations. Many of them are women. But, a code of conduct is really only as powerful as the supervision of whoever's supposed to implement it, first of all, right? And so you actually have to look at these systems on the ground. Is anybody can sign a code of conduct and promise to live up to it, but are there effective mechanisms for Indigenous people to make complaints when that code of conduct is violated that feel safe and feel accessible and feel actionable? And, WWF, for example, says that they've set one of those up around Salonga and other parks in the wake of this scandal that they experienced and created. And, whether or not that's functioning the way that it should, we don't really know. There hasn't really been an adequate amount of reporting or research, I think, to say, how much really has changed. And also, I think it's important to recognize that we don't want to just take the worst abuses and say, well, if we, are preventing murder and sexual abuse and, physical violence against Indigenous peoples, that's obviously important and it's necessary. But then there's a whole other range of activities that are carried out under the name of conservation in protected areas that might not rise to the level of being a quote-unquote serious human rights abuse, but are also very disruptive to Indigenous community life, to their history, and in some cases to their culture.
Samuel agrees a lack of clear and enforceable rules leads to an abuse of power. However, he highlighted that many rangers don't differentiate between locals and outside poachers coming into the land to kill wildlife. In other cases, they're active targets of militant groups, and cases of mistaken identity with locals can occur. Rangers are sometimes killed by poachers or militants, but when they leave the park, locals are left to contend with the ire and fear of the rangers, who may see them as connected to that violence.
I think everywhere where people have some power, if the rules are not clear enough, they tend to abuse that power. At the local level, where protected areas are often located, you have rangers and you have communities living in the same areas. And sometimes it is difficult for the rangers and for the communities to very clearly understand each other, to know why the rangers are there and why the communities are there. And on top of that, you have to add one extra element. All those hunting in the area are not communities, are not from local and indigenous communities. They are people coming from far away, hunting in the area, but very often for the rangers, they are all perceived as being members of the local communities. So sometimes rangers have been hurt, rangers have been killed, and they have been injured, severely injured in many places. And this can result into an increased level of violence on the side of the rangers, but not always on the right people. So if they are injured by a professional poacher coming from far away from the village, the poacher will not be around forever. When he disappears, it is possible that the change of behavior of the rangers will focus on local and indigenous communities who are always around and who from time to time will be either trying to get into the park or, well, just be living in the area. So this is something that happens. But at the same time, I think there is also a lot of frustration on the side of villagers who do not understand why they cannot continue to have access to what they consider as being their land and their resources, and who as a result of that sometimes are very clearly and openly opposed to the rangers. And so I think the tension comes from the fact that those actors are in the same location and the roles are not clear enough and the rules are not clear enough. For the communities, land and resources belong to them. For the rangers, communities have no rights to land and resources. So if they try to have access to land or to have access to the resources, they are breaking the laws and should be punished. And I think this is the situation that brings tension and that brings violence, because you cannot prevent communities from accessing what they consider as being their land. It is just impossible. It's part of their livelihoods. So they will do everything possible to continue to get resources inside what is a protected area.
The Africa Protected Areas Congress met for the first time in 2022 in Kigali, Rwanda, purportedly in an attempt to address some of these issues. Samuel says this is a step in the right direction and a way to include Indigenous voices, which had been historically excluded, but that ultimately a social gathering isn't enough. Action is required.
I think it was very useful for Africa to host such a meeting, bringing together conservationists from all over the continent, but also local communities, NGOs supporting them, government officials, donors funding conservation. I think it's a place where issues can be put on the table and discussed, and where all the actors will have the possibility of hearing the perspective of all the other actors, especially local and indigenous communities' perspective, which are often overlooked, not voiced enough. And I think besides that, there could be also a possibility of sharing good practices and seeing how those good practices can be adjusted and adapted in different places. I think it has the potential for being a good gathering that could change in the future the way conservation is handled, managed, and implemented in Africa. But it's not enough to have such a gathering. I think it takes a bit more than a gathering to get there.
What action could that be? The Kigali Call to Action, which was created at the Congress, offers one potential way forward. Conservation leaders acknowledged the ongoing injustices faced by Indigenous communities and called for them to be halted. It sounds good, but many, including Samuel, say while this is a step in the right direction, it doesn't quite go far enough, and the DRC didn't participate in discussion on the Kigali Call to Action. Still, Samuel says, it is a confirmation that, despite what has been said about indigenous communities, many of them are not against conservation action. On the contrary, they are the stewards of it, as is well documented by research, but they want to be in the driver's seat.
I think it was the Kigali meeting in itself gave a lot of room to local and indigenous communities, which was good for many people to hear what communities think about how conservation should be done. And I think the key messages that I got from Kigali were, one, local and indigenous people are absolutely not against conservation, as some people tend to believe it. They are not against conservation. In fact, they were the first to conserve nature. So if today we still have biodiversity hotspots on the continent, is thanks to the work of local and indigenous communities. This, to me, was the very first message. The second message is that local and indigenous communities are still willing to see conservation happen, but they want to be involved and they want to be in the driver's seat, which could be which is understandable because they have been doing so for ages, for centuries. The third message that I got very clearly was that the states, the conservation agencies, the donors have to work together to better involve local and indigenous communities in conservation. This was the call from communities. They want their cultures to be recognized. They want their lives not to be destroyed by conservation. They want to be part of it, and they want to be empowered to manage conservation, because this is also what they want to achieve. They are the first beneficiaries of unhealthy nature. And this is very clearly what they try to express during the meeting there.
We'll return to what that would look like a little later on, but first, let's look at an added layer of complexity we haven't touched upon yet, exacerbating the tension between rangers and locals, in some cases, which is the so-called militarization of conservation and the rangers who patrol protected areas in fragile states. In countries like Chad, the Central African Republic, and now Benin, that means they're often bumping into armed militants engaged in hostilities against the state. For groups like African Parks, a public-private hybrid conservation NGO that maintains its own standing armed ranger force in over a dozen countries, this can lead to some murky waters.
Okay, I want to make this really clear, is that comment and quote was very specifically about African Parks' operations in Benin. So African Parks is a really, really interesting example of a lot of sort of modern trends in conservation, both in terms of it's a very privatized system. I mean, they're technically a nonprofit, but, they function sort of outside of direct state management. Essentially, their model, which is a little bit different from some other organizations like WWF or Conservation International, is they'll sign an agreement with a host government to manage a specific space, whether it's a national park or a protected area. And then after that, they sort of, they're left to their own management devices. So they hire their own rangers, they finance their own activities. They really everything from reintroducing wildlife to boundary and other kinds of spatial policing are done under their management plan that they share with the governments and they sign with them, but they're really sort of self-contained units. And they manage a tremendous amount of parks across Africa. I think they're up to, it must be close to 20 at this point. And if you look at the amount of land that those parks cover, it's something approximating, I think it's upwards of 16 million hectares, which is a tremendous amount of land. And each of these parks are in a very different security and, political kind of context. You have some parks that are in very peaceful areas where maybe, the primary threat is small scale hunting or encroachment by loggers or something like that. And then you have other parks that they work in places like the Democratic Republic of Congo, in the Central African Republic, Chad, and Benin, where they're very much surrounded by and engaged with on a regular basis very serious militancy and insurgent activity that isn't directly, aimed at their operations, but often you see them sort of get into the crossfire, whether that's between rival groups or between these groups and the government. And so when that researcher from an organization called ACLED that tracks conflict statistics called African Parks, a quote-unquote counterterrorism unit, that was a reference specifically to its operations in Benin, which, we can talk a little bit about that.
Militarization of ranger patrols isn't unique to African parks, and it is definitely not new. Other NGOs are looking to increase their own ranger capacity for many of the same reasons. In the colonial era of the Congo Basin, Samuel says it was this very militarization that served as the basis for conservation going forward.
I think it's a very difficult and sensitive issue. Militarization started in the colonial time, and I think the purpose was to protect areas where there was a lot of biodiversity, to allow game hunting and visits by visitors from colonial powers. And this was done at the expenses of communities. There was a need to protect some areas against local communities so that colonialists could enjoy those places. And then conservation, I think, was built on that model. And in the very first days of independence, the state took over and started also protecting protected areas with military force or paramilitary forces.
Today, the situation is different. Samuel describes an instance, now a decade ago, where armed Sudanese elephant poachers raided Cameroon's Buba Njida National Park, killing 80% of the elephant population. The outgunned rangers reportedly could not hold them back. In response, Cameroon sent in their army.
I think today the issue is a little bit different because we have seen armed forces trying to have access to places where they can find sources of income through the biodiversity. In the north of Cameroon, for example, some few years ago, there were armed groups coming from Sudan and attacking two protected areas, killing with massive killings of elephants for the ivory. And the eco guards who were there were not up to the task. They were not able to fight against those very well-trained paramilitary forces coming from so far away. So the government was obliged to send in the special forces of Cameroon. And even then, it was still not enough. In the very first days, there were a lot of killings. I think 5 or 6 of the special forces were killed, showing you the capacity of this new category of poachers. So today, militarization has increased, especially near the borders or in areas where there is insecurity, as a way to respond to the militarization of the poachers, coming with machine guns and not with traditional weapons. They are very well organized, they are very well trained, they are very well equipped, and some of our states are responding to that by increasing the militarization. This was not the case before the events I told you about. The so-called militarization was organized by what we call eco guards. They were not soldiers at all, and they were using very old guns from the First World War, the Mass 36, sometimes not really working. I think it was much more intimidation against small poachers coming from villages. But today, yes, we really have an escalation towards an increased level of militarization on both sides. We really hope the governments will be able to ensure security on the territories and on the boundaries everywhere in Central Africa, so that the army will leave the protected areas, because this presence of military forces from the government and from rebel groups is absolutely not safe for the communities.
Ashoka details another example, but instead of a state-controlled army swooping in, it's the rangers themselves being sucked into violence. In Benin's W National Park, not far from the Congo Basin, a long, simmering insurgency that began in Mali has started to creep into the park over the last 2 years. Militants have actively targeted rangers and conservation officials in the area, thrusting African Parks, which manages the park, into a role that one expert has described as counter-terrorism. African Parks assertively denies this, but acknowledges their rangers have been killed in terrorist attacks.
So, to make a very complicated story as succinct as I can, there's a tremendous amount of political instability and violence right now in a region of West Africa called the Sahel. So this is sort of the savanna, brushy area between the coastal rainforests of West Africa and the kind of real desert Sahara of North Central Africa. So this band has seen a tremendous amount of militant activity from Islamic fundamentalist groups that emerged partially as a result of the toppling of Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. And France has been engaged in kind of conflicts with these groups. Other governments have, Niger. There's been a tremendous amount of violence and instability related to this conflict. And in Benin, which had up until about 2021 sort of been on the fringes of this violence, but not really had to deal with it, there are a number of really kind of highly important conservation parks in the northern part of the country that border on other countries that have experienced a lot of violence related to this conflict in the last 5 or 6 years. So that would be Burkina Faso and Niger primarily. Beginning in, I think, 2017, somewhere around there, African Parks took over the management of the Benin side of 2 of these parks, Pendjari and W. And these parks are sort of partially in one country and partially in Benin. And in 2021, what started to happen was these insurgent groups that had previously been operating further to the north in Burkina Faso and Niger began to move down into these 2 parks. And partially this was so that they could hide from French airstrikes, partially this was so that they could recruit, and partially, unfortunately, sometimes protected areas are good places to hide. They tend to be forested, there's a heavy canopy, they're away from prying eyes. Now, African Parks, because they have their own ranger force, was to an extent responsible for patrolling these parts of Benin that bordered on Burkina Faso and Niger. And as these militant groups moved into the park from the north, rangers from African Parks kind of started to bump up against them. And at first, the research that I read and that I did for my piece, that the first sort of engagements were more kind of just seeing somebody, seeing people moving through the bush and wondering what was going on and then tracking them, et cetera, et cetera. And then over time, some of these engagements became more hostile. And there's a lot of reasons why for that. This has been something that we've seen in this area of what they call the W. Arli Pendjari National Park for about 4 or 5 years now, is that as militant groups move in, there has often been a very violent approach towards conservation organizations and rangers in these parks, partially because it's just a kind of like battle over controlling territory, and also partially because, and this needs to really be addressed, that there are a lot of historical grievances among the local populations about these parks. They were set up in the colonial times. They involved loss of resources, and there's still a lot of resentment by a lot of people about, why can't I go into this area to hunt or fish or gather firewood that my grandfather used to freely go in and out of, right? So some of these groups have found, according to the research that I've read, it useful for recruiting to establish a hostile relationship with the conservation groups who are tasked with spatial management of these parks. For example, Rory Young, who's a sort of famed conservationist that ran an organization called Chengeta Wildlife, was killed in Burkina Faso, not far away from Benin, I think in 2021. So as these groups moved into African Parks' zone of operations in northern Benin, all of a sudden, I think African Parks found itself in a really sort of unfamiliar and difficult position where they were responsible for a whole chunk of the country that suddenly had militants really trying to assert their presence into it. And researchers who really looked at their operations at that time suggested that some of the interviews that they'd done with their staff indicated that, for example, they were coordinating some military activity, they were tracking militants, they were sharing information in real time with the Beninese government. And to an extent, these are all things that you would expect they would do. You know, African Parks is just point blank, well-financed. They have a lot of equipment, a lot of manpower, a lot of gear. And some of that stuff really isn't possessed by the Beninese military. So because of that sort of position that they were in, I think that they would say, and they actually didn't say this to me, they were very hesitant to confirm any of this stuff, but what it appeared to me is that they were kind of pushed into this role of kind of, not quite just doing conservation work. There was a bit more of a security dynamic, and I think that this is part of the concern that people who see the more kind of forceful turn of conservation towards this type of like heavy policing and militarized border control management might say is that, if you're walking around with a hammer, you might wind up having to bang a couple of nails down. And whether that's a good thing for conservation or not is something that seems like it's really worth debating.
And it is a debate that's happening. I asked Samuel to give me his take on this type of situation and whether or not it's also a problem in the Congo Basin. He points out that the borders of Central African nations are often in heavily forested areas, giving militant groups an advantage, both of cover for operations or interests they have politically, and also for generating income by poaching wildlife. And so he argues that the militarization of these borders is difficult to avoid because they are so insecure. Some of these borders are under the jurisdiction of park management, and some are not, but they are often the front line of these developing conflicts. As Ashoka pointed out earlier, African Parks is well funded in comparison to a military such as Benin's, and may have equipment on hand that they don't, so there's a definite benefit for the state to use the services of established NGOs. Samuel says that NGOs are beginning partnerships with state agencies to give them rights over protected areas in locations such as these.
I think we are blessed in the Congo Basin with a very high level of biodiversity, and we have a huge diversity of biodiversity hotspots all over the countries in Central Africa. And in some of the places, we are also blessed with transboundary protected areas. When you have a transboundary protected area, you have a space under the sovereignty of two different countries, but you have to manage the wildlife going from one country to the other. So there is a need for cooperation. In addition to that, we also have some protected areas at the boundary of one country and a simple forest on the other side of the boundary in the other country. So that's not a protected area, but there are exchanges of biodiversity between the protected area in one country and the forest in the other country. And last point is that most of our boundaries are in the forest, in places that are not covered by villages, by houses. So with the level of insecurity that we are witnessing in Central Africa, more and more, if nothing is done, those boundaries covered on both sides by the forest can offer a very good base for groups that want to destabilize one country or the other, and can also offer a lot of possibilities for those same groups for generating income by poaching. There is a huge demand in the world for elements of forest biodiversity, either vegetal or animal biodiversity, the fauna. So that's a market. The market exists. And on the other side, you have some armed groups looking for ways to fund their activities. And one of the safest ways, easiest ways could be to continue targeting the wildlife as a way of generating income. This, as I said, will be pushing more and more the states to increased militarization of the protection of the parks, because this will be protection of the park will be included in the protection of boundaries. And there is a current trend for the establishment of public-private partnerships in the management of protected areas, through which conservation agencies want to sign with the states contracts granting the conservation agency long-term rights and extended rights in the management of protected areas. That could be understandable because this will help them secure long-term funding for the protection of the areas.
According to Samuel, many contracts like this have already been signed, while some nations are hesitant to move forward with them. A complicating factor in the conversation is that a border that is under the protection of a private organization is still considered the responsibility of the government. But if a private entity is in charge of that region and has rights to it, how can a state government ensure oversight?
But some of the questions arising are questions about sovereignty. Is it possible to transfer the right to manage such huge areas of the territories, very often located close to the boundaries, to institutions that are not controlled by the state? This is a discussion within government authorities. And I think one of the reasons that this is currently being discussed is the fact that anything happening on the boundary will still have to be considered as being under the responsibility of the government, no matter who does it. If you have a contract with the government, this will be considered as being done by the government. Protecting those areas involve military, and I don't think the government will be ready to get rid of its sovereign right to keep the armed force under their control on the territory. So this is the current discussion in Central Africa. Some of these contracts have already been signed. Other countries are still discussing the possibility of doing that and are very reluctant to go as far as that.
When I asked Samuel the way forward here, he believes that states should be improving their own security across the Congo Basin so that management of protected areas can return to civilian control.
And to come back to, and what I said was that it will be very useful for the states to be able to improve security in the whole Congo Basin area, in all Central African countries, so that the militaries can be back in the barracks and the conservation can continue to be done by civilians.
But when it comes to alleviating the tension between rangers and local communities, Samuel thinks that the involvement of locals through compromise agreements, much like the one he outlined in Cameroon's Campo Mound National Park, is the best way forward.
What will be the best way to address the fact that civilians and rangers are also being more and more involved into tensions with communities? I think that there have been discussions with a lot of communities in Central Africa, and there are some few trends suggesting solutions. One of the solutions will be to work with local communities around the park and involve them into the management of the park and into the protection of the park by finding a compromise. If communities are involved into the protection of the park, they will be rewarded somehow, into brackets, by the recognition of their possibility of accessing and using the park, using products of the park, including hunting, but limited hunting, on conditions that are agreed by the government protecting the area and the communities getting involved into the protection of the area. The purpose is at the end to start a process through which, at the end of the process, communities will be in the driver's seats of conservation, and state and conservation agencies will be providing the technical support and if necessary, the technical and scientific support, and if necessary, if, for example, we continue having armed groups coming from abroad, the military protection. But communities should be in the driver's seats. Today is not possible, given the very huge size of land to be protected. Those lands are not under the control of a single community, but of a diversity of communities. And at least putting them together and making sure that they share the same priorities, they can organize their action, I think it will take some time. So it will still be necessary to have the state and to have conservation agencies at this stage, but providing training to local and indigenous communities and making sure that at the end of the day, they are able to gradually get into the manager's position and finally running the parks with the support of those who are now in charge of running it.
However, Vedaste remains skeptical of declarations like the Kigali Call to Action and meetings like the Africa Protected Areas Congress, saying there are too many disparate interests from various nations for everyone to be on the same page.
Toutes les attractions, les tractations qui se passent entre les États de l'Afrique, de la région, est-ce qu'avec la conservation,
during all the negotiations that are going on between the states in Africa and in the region, can conservation solve these problems as well as politics? Can the injustices of the past be resolved through these actions taken in Kigali? Because we realize that every time, and this is what is problematic in conservation, every time we take decisions, the problem is the implementation of these decisions. If we go very far and analyze the issues of the cooperative of the parties, such as COP27, we realize that the states do not manage to hold a unified discourse. That states do not manage to agree because there are national and private interests for each state, and then each time we start to take decisions, there is no implementation.
Il n'y a aucune mise en application.
Ashoka points out that many governments are also holding on to the fortress conservation model due to what they might view as success.
You know, politicians, they like this approach. I mean, that's just the bottom line, is that Paul Kagame in Rwanda is a huge fan of African parks. I think he really credits them with rescuing Akagera Park. And what I heard sort of through the grapevine when I was doing my reporting is that the reason that African parks made it to Benin is Benin's president, Patrice Talon, visited Akagera and was so impressed with what African parks had done that that his government signed a contract. And really that contract is like, it bypasses local conservation organizations. It's really like the African parks has a direct line to his office. And so this is where you sort of have to look at it like, okay, if it's sort of working in Rwanda, then you export that model to Benin. Well, Benin's maybe a different context, and they might encounter completely different challenges that they wouldn't have gotten in this first place. And so, I mean, I think these are tricky questions. It's like you achieve success, but at what cost?
Ashoka believes, at the end of the day, the Congo Basin is too vast and varied, both politically and environmentally, for a one-size-fits-all approach, and that the current trend of securitized conservation warrants the criticism it's getting.
I mean, I think it's sort of worthy of saying that there's not going to be a one-size-fits-all approach in a place as varied as the Congo Basin. I mean, you're dealing, even within these countries, you're dealing with, vast amounts of different peoples and different histories, different cultures. So different approaches towards protecting wildlife and biodiversity are going to be necessary on a case-by-case basis. And I would say I think that the track record of WWF and the ICCN, especially in the DRC, but also in the Republic of Congo and Cameroon, suggests that a forceful and violent approach towards conservation. I mean, we didn't even talk about Virunga, but Virunga is this park that's gotten so much positive press, but actually, if you look at it closely, there's a lot of allegations of really serious abuses that have happened there as well, in addition to deaths and attacks against rangers by armed groups there as well. So the question I think that is important to ask ourselves about the Congo Basin is really, is this securitized approach to conservation working? And what's the cost? Are there alternatives, and what might those alternatives look like? And a lot of people are really kind of like cracking their heads against that question. But I think it's important to be skeptical of anybody who tells you that they really have the answer.
As we covered in episode 1 of this series, the Congo Basin is under immense pressure from extractive industries such as oil and gas, mining, logging, and also agriculture. The government of the DRC opening up 27 blocks for the auction of oil and gas development doesn't simplify the situation, and only makes achieving conservation targets a greater challenge. Samuel points out that to achieve the conservation targets laid out in the 30 by 30 declaration, the current amount of protected areas in the Congo Basin would need to double, which he says is impossible currently. But there is a solution, he thinks, in community-led conservation, which could surpass the 30 by 30 goals.
To get to the 30 by 30 involves in the next 6 years to double the size of existing protected areas if you want to get there. But this is absolutely not possible under the current conditions. Because of the very high level of pressure on land and resources, it will not be possible to double the size of protected areas in Congo Basin countries without having huge conflicts with communities. But there is a solution, there is a huge opportunity to bring in communities into community-led conservation. Because the stake when you discuss community conservation and communities' rights, as I told you, is the community's claim on land and resources. So they will not let conservation control their land and control their access to what they consider as being their resources. But if they are empowered to get involved and to manage conservation, community-led conservation, it will be possible to get far more than the 30% of the territories, provided that all the new areas under conservation are controlled and managed by the communities. We will be able to get far more than the 15%. So again, if you want to meet the commitments, there is no other possibilities of meeting the commitment without involving communities, without having the communities transforming their land into community-led conservation. And there are many communities ready to do that as a way to protect their land. It's a unique opportunity at this stage that the government should be seizing to make sure that land will be protected, resources will be protected, the biodiversity will be protected, and the goals will be achieved without having any additional sources of tensions.
I'd like to thank Vedaste, Samuel, and Ashoka for speaking with me for this episode of Mongabay Explores. This was episode 2. I'm your host, Mike DiGirolamo. Editorial support for this episode was provided by Latoya Abulu, Ashoka Mukpo, Tena Giuse, and Eric Hoffner. The script was written by myself. French translations were provided by Latoya Abulu. The soundscapes heard in the intro and outro were recorded in Mvindo National Park by Zuzana Burabalova, Walter Mbami, Tatiana Sachivi, and Serge Ekazama. They would like to acknowledge Masaha and Mvindo National Park. If you enjoyed this episode of Mongabay Explores and you want to support us, please tell a friend about this podcast series. Word of mouth is the best way to help expand our reach and keep growing. Don't forget to leave a review, as that also helps our visibility. You can also support us by heading to patreon.com at patreon.com/Mongabay, where you can donate to help us cover production costs and hosting fees for our podcast content. Keep up with Mongabay on all our social media platforms at Facebook, Mastodon, LinkedIn, and Instagram, where our handle is @Mongabay, or on Twitter @MongabayOrg. We'll be back soon with another episode in this Congo Basin series of Mongabay Explores.